America's mental health is foremost in our discussion today. We talk a little bit about what the president has said and why what you're being told is dangerous is not the most dangerous thing he said. I'm Vong. This is a civil moment. We've talked about gun control. We've talked about Parkland. We've said, and many Americans correctly believe, that an accurate accounting of Parkland can't be had without a discussion about mental health. We're going to cover mental health in detail a little bit later. We'll first briefly talk about some of the things that the president has recently said. Here's his take on guns and due process.
Take the firearms first and then go to court, because that's another system. Because a lot of times by the time you go to court, it takes so long to go to court to get the due process procedures. I like taking the guns early.
Well, that's not what due process means. The Fifth Amendment says very clearly that no person may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. We can at least take comfort in the knowledge that he has no unilateral power to disenfranchise our citizens of their right to due process. Well, we know that words being what they are, and Trump being who he is, whatever actions or legislation is proposed, we won't find ourselves having to defend both the Second and Fifth Amendments. But we should understand where his words are coming from. If there is an opportunity to avert tragedy before it happens, we should seize that opportunity. There should be mechanisms and procedures in place to do so in response to clear or present danger that does not infringe on our Fifth Amendment rights. There are, in fact, such procedures. We are reminded that even with the power to act quickly, if we ignore the warning signs, if we fail to act when the opportunity is presented time and time again, then in the aftermath of such failure, the government cannot rightly demand greater authority or greater power. We don't give more responsibility to our children when they fail to meet the ones they already have. And even if our government would like us to do so, we must never forget that the government exists to serve its citizens and never the other way around. But Trump said something else, something that perhaps is even greater cause for concern. The media, at least, was very concerned.
Don't forget, China's great, and Xi is a great gentleman. He's now president for life. President for life. No, he's great. Hey, look, he was able to do that. I think it's great. Maybe we'll have to give that a shot someday.
We'll have to give that a shot someday, he said, about being president for life. I don't know if everyone else that's reacting to this statement has heard the same one I just did and that you just did, but that was very obviously a joke. You can tell by his delivery, you can tell by the response in the room. This is just Trump being a showman. So we're supposed to believe now the 22nd Amendment that limits the number of terms for president is under attack as well? No, not really. Now, people are plenty upset that Trump has even one term. They have nightmares about a second term, and they'll probably start scaling the wall Trump wants to build to escape into Mexico if he somehow manages a third term. But that's not the part of what he said that should be concerning. He says that President Xi Jinping of China is a gentleman. His tone does not suggest that he is joking. His tone suggests maybe admiration. Now, Trump already views China's trade surplus as something to be admired or even envied. This has probably helped him make his decision regarding his recent announcement on steel and aluminum tariffs that he intends to impose. There are a lot of people who view these kinds of protectionist policies as doing more harm than good. His own economic advisor, Gary Cohn, has just announced his resignation, and there's no doubt that this was probably a motivating factor. But even discounting Trump's admiration for China's trade policies, do these statements signal a willingness to look past China's human rights abuses? The millions of people who suffer under communist rule in China? Does he admire the authoritarianism clearly exhibited by Xi Jinping's seizing of a lifetime of power? High-ranking Navy and Marine Corps officials have expressed concerns over China using capital as a weapon, buying up foreign land and resources to, quote, win without fighting. China also has a long-standing disdain and disregard for intellectual property rights. Counterfeits and fakes, and just plain theft of research ideas and engineering flood the world's markets through eBay and Alibaba. Steel is important, yes, but far less important than the ingenuity of American citizens. The inventiveness of the American people is not just a testament to their creativity, but also to the values and virtues and society that incubates and gives support to those ideas becoming reality. That support system, that infrastructure, does not come without cost and investment. When China steals, it steals the yield of those investments and pays for none of its cost. Theft of intellectual property costs the United States anywhere from $225 billion to $600 billion a year. China accounts for 87% of the counterfeit goods seized entering the United States. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't have good relations with China. This is not to say we shouldn't have peaceable relations with China. One of Nixon's greatest achievements was normalizing relations with China. And China has a rich and long history. The Chinese, in fact, invented guns and gunpowder, though now, ironically, their citizens no longer have the right to possess them. And nothing is black and white as much and as easily as they are cast into that light. But whereas President Trump has almost no unilateral power to rescind our due process rights, the executive branch has tremendous leeway and latitude to dictate foreign policy. And that is why his admiration of Xi is concerning. China is still America's polite adversary. And there are things about China that are very dangerous and very dark, and we should take care that the things Trump may find admirable in China are the things that are worthy of admiration. There is allured power, and Trump has no practice in restraint. Though what has become obvious, or really what has always been obvious about Trump, is that he says a lot of things, and some of those things are unapologetically foolish. We should pay more attention to what he does. We should pay more attention to what his administration is doing and has done. But rhetoric does matter. What Trump says does matter. The President of the United States has unique ability to make the entire world listen when he speaks. What Trump says and the manner in how he says it is probably the thing that makes Trump Trump. His base takes great pleasure when he triggers the left. And the left marinate in the outrage factory that is Trump's Twitter account. And has there ever been a president more suited to the age of Twitter? He is not crazy, no matter how many people would like to label him as such. If he commits a crime, no lawyer could get a jury to acquit him on an insanity defense. And yet, he says things that many can dismiss as crazy. So what does crazy mean? Merriam-Webster defines it as not mentally sound, marked by thought or action that lacks reason. We have no objective measure of reason, so to some, crazy just means anyone whose opinions and actions differ sufficiently from their own. For some of us, maybe crazy means any opinion different from our own. For some of us, we don't know how to define crazy, but we certainly know crazy when we see it. So that brings us to mental health in America. However we define crazy, we can all agree that committing acts of mass violence and murder without motive requires some degree of mental illness. Now, the vast majority of people with mental illness are not a danger to others. And while the perpetrators of mass killings are 20 times more likely to be psychotic or delusional than the general population, mass killings are extremely rare. And they're only in the public consciousness because that rarity makes them newsworthy. Now, mental illness does not only present as psychosis or delusion. There's schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, panic attacks, and so on. And only a small percentage of those who suffer are a danger to themselves, and an even smaller percentage a danger to others. But that doesn't mean it's not worth talking about. If we are to cast a light in this country every time something tragic occurs, should we not shine that light into the dark places where people suffer outside the public eye? Aren't we better off if we must do something? To have that something be something that might help millions, including the one or two among those millions who might have otherwise gone on to do great harm, instead of doing something in the form of gun control, and surrender ourselves to being ruled by ignorance and emotion, and attacking the rights of dozens of millions, hoping to ensnare the one or two who will go on, regardless, to do great harm. Because if you try to take away their rifles, they're going to get a rifle anyway, or they'll use a pistol, as they did at Virginia Tech. And if you try to take away their pistols, they're going to get one anyway, or they'll attack you with knives, as they did in Japan, where 19 were killed. If you want to take away their knives, which you can't, then they'll use a truck, as they did in France, where they killed 86 and injured 450 more. If you take away their trucks, which you can't, then they'll use bombs, which you've already taken away. But they got them anyway, as they did in Oklahoma City. But since we are intent on shining a light, and since many of us are hurt and angry and looking to do something, let us instead do something positive. Here's DeMar DeRozan, NBA player, talking about his struggle with depression.
I think, have it be something that, I know a lot of people ashamed to talk about it. Even myself for a long period of time, people wonder why I was such a quiet guy, and that was part of it, not wanting to speak out about it, not wanting other people to know exactly what I was going through.
And he's right. There is stigma attached to mental illness. And in fact, calling someone crazy is dismissive. Once you call someone crazy, you don't have to listen to what they have to say. And after all, why would you? They're crazy. But mental illness is not just about being crazy. DeMar DeRozan plays for the Toronto Raptors. They're going to make the playoffs this year, and they're most likely going to do very well. DeMar is currently in the middle of a 5-year, $140 million contract, and he'll make $28 million this year in salary, before endorsements and outside earnings. He is exceptionally talented and skilled. He has a beautiful family. He has thousands of adoring fans, and by all accounts, he has a support structure that is amazing. He also suffers from mental illness. Kevin Love, Cleveland Cavaliers star, recently said that thanks to DeMar going public, he felt he could tell people that he suffers from panic attacks. Panic attacks so bad, he had to leave a basketball game while it was being played. Kevin Love is also doing fine financially. Kevin Love certainly has family and fans. Kevin Love has a similarly amazing support structure, but he also suffers from mental illness. When DeMar speaks, people listen. When Kevin speaks, people listen, and that's a good thing. Imagine, though, if you are young, almost a child, if your mother dies and leaves you alone in the world. Imagine if you suffer from mental illness, you have suicidal thoughts, you have homicidal ideas, you don't hide them. You have concerns that you might kill yourself and believe that you might be capable of great evil, and you out your mental health decline in a 911 call you make yourself. Quote, "The thing is, I lost my mother a couple of days ago, so I'm dealing with a bunch of things right now." The police come to your house 24 times, often responding to violent incidences. Nothing is done. And then you snap. Now, we do not seek to, nor should we ever excuse evil. But if we are to solve, if we are at least to mitigate, if we are to do something, then we must first understand. And why was nothing done? It's not always been this way. In 1959, California alone had 37,500 patients in psychiatric hospitals. In psychiatric hospitals today, nationwide, there are 40,000 patients. That's less than 1/10 the number of patients they cared for in 1959. And the U.S. population in 1959 was about 175 million. Today, there are 327 million people in the United States. That's a decline of over 95% in the availability of care for these patients. Now, those people haven't gone anywhere. And that is to say, just because they're not in the psychiatric hospitals doesn't mean they have vanished from our society. In our homeless population, 1 in 3 suffer from serious mental health issues. They are in our prison systems. At Rikers, for instance, similarly, 1 in 3 suffer from serious mental health issues. But they only go to prison after they have committed a criminal act. The vast majority of the people who suffer from mental illness are nowhere. And that is to say, they are everywhere. And we see them every day in our supermarkets and on our streets, in the places where we work. In fact, we probably work alongside them. And maybe we have, a crazy Uncle Joe. The one they say he's always been like that. But whereas Uncle Joe is probably harmless, Uncle Joe probably is not going to be taking his life, Uncle Joe is not going to harm himself or others. But in this nation where in 2014, 1 in 8 American adults reported antidepressant use, in a nation where amongst 1 million harmless Uncle Joes, there might be one person on the verge of doing something horrific. Now, a person's mental health, just like their physical health, is no one's business but their own. The dignity with how we choose to live our lives, how we deal with our mental and physical infirmities is no one's business, and certainly not the government's business. But the freedom to swing our figurative fists however we like ends where another person's face begins. Uncle Joe would be better off if he had the help he needed, and we would all be better off if those who would otherwise do great harm got the help they needed. In 1959, the Parkland shooter probably would have been put into a psychiatric hospital. But in the late 50s and 60s, mental health experts testified to Congress advocating an end to those psychiatric institutions, testimony that was recorded into thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts. Those testimonies made the case that state hospitals and psychiatric hospitals should be shut down in favor of community-based facilities. Just the idea of a psychiatric hospital burns into our collective minds the images of Nurse Ratched, Shutter Island, Arkham Asylum, American Horror Story, places where the insane were put away to be forgotten. We think of terrible conditions, patients thrashing while tethered to beds with thick leather straps being administered tranquilizers until they are wheeled away, drooling into windowless rooms. And in fact, that's what happened. Tranquilizers were purchased by the literal truckload. In the age of Nurse Ratched and transorbital lobotomies, tranquilizers were the best tool available. The testimony to Congress by those psychiatrists and medical policymakers was that those drugs were being used, overused, and abused, and that those drugs were being relied upon to do the work of society. We have far better tools now, better treatments, better medications, a better understanding that our prefrontal cortex is implicated as a place where our social behaviors, complex cognitive processes, and our very personal expression is planned. That to put a utensil that is essentially an ice pick through the orbit of the eye, that is transorbital, and scrape away the prefrontal cortex in an attempt to halt so-called distressing emotions is in fact a barbaric practice. Dr. Robert Felix, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and a proponent of the shift from state hospitals to community centers said, quote, "Many of those patients who left the state hospitals never should have done so. We psychiatrists saw too much of the old snake pit, saw too many people who shouldn't have been there, and we overreacted. The result is not what we intended, and perhaps we didn't ask the questions that should have been asked when developing a new concept. But psychiatrists are human too, and we tried our damnedest." In 1962, and in that time when Ken Kesey wrote his novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, those psychiatric hospitals were largely horrifying places. Congress passed the Community Health Act in 1963. John F. Kennedy signed it into law. The idea was to replace state hospitals with community-based care as an alternative to institutionalization. But only half the proposed centers were ever built. None were ever fully funded. And the act never provided money to operate them long-term. Many of them sit now abandoned wrecks, and many were demolished to make way for strip malls and used car lots. Medicaid was adopted in 1965, and deinstitutionalization accelerated. The patients were an enormous financial burden, with New York alone spending $500 million a year in 1960s dollars for treatments and care of the patients in state hospitals. We tore down the brick buildings. We retired Nurse Ratched. And the patients? We dumped them into the streets. In 1980, Jimmy Carter signed into law the Mental Health Systems Act, with the idea being that grants would be given to community health centers. During Ronald Reagan's term, Congress repealed most of that law. Now, Reagan today often gets blamed for the current state of mental health in this country. But as we look at Social Security and see that it engulfs a quarter of the federal budget at a whopping $916 billion last year, with Medicaid, Medicare, CHIP, and other government healthcare programs costing another quarter of the federal budget at a cost exceeding over $1 trillion a year. Is socialized mental health care the next panacea for our mental health issues? Once again, like the abused drugs and tranquilizers, is public money supposed to do the work that our society has failed to do? The federal government has no acumen for doing anything efficiently, but they are often the provider of last resort when local communities and state governments fail to meet the needs of its citizens. The easiest thing to propose is to throw money at it. Education problems? Throw money at it. Then watch it wasted on administrators and bureaucrats and countless so-called vital programs, while teachers spend money out of their own pockets to put pencils in their students' hands. And why do we think it would be different with mental health? We can do better. We must do better, and not just for Uncle Joe and Uncle Joe's sake, but for all our sakes. What DeMar DeRozan has to say, what Kevin Love has to say, is positive. Because at its core, our mental health problems are a societal and cultural problem. The first step, as they say, is to recognize the problem. The education of our citizens to recognize mental health issues for themselves, our families, or neighbors is a good start. There's a difference between living a terrible life, being in a terrible situation, and depression. They are not necessarily linked. DeMar's life, by all accounts, is a good life. Whatever help he is seeking will help him deal with and hopefully overcome his depression so that he can better enjoy his life. Now, this is not to suggest that you can't have a terrible life and depression, and that they can't be linked. But whereas a person in a terrible situation might be advised to make better choices and thereby overcome their situation, you cannot tell a person who suffers from depression to get over it or try being happy instead. You might as well ask a lion to try grazing on grass instead. The onset of depression can include links to genetics, hormone levels, medical conditions, stress, grief, and yes, difficult life circumstances. Any or all of these can precipitate the changes that lead to depression symptoms. Between 1999 and 2014, antidepressant use in the United States rose by 65%. The rise of more effective and readily available medication contributes to this. And while 1 in 8 Americans may be on antidepressants at any given time, the idea that people rush to medication has little merit. Most psychiatrists will tell you that in their practice, where they prescribe medication, it is only after great effort convincing the patient the medication might help them do they agree. And before we go further, it needs to be said that incontrovertibly, without doubt, antidepressants save lives. They save lives in the literal sense by averting suicides. They save lives in the figurative sense, in that it can make someone feel like their life is worth living again. Up to 21% of women and 12% of men will suffer from depression at some point in their lives. Our lives are faster paced and more stressful than they have ever been in the past, but more than that, we are absolutely inundated with news of the day that contains, more often than not, doom and gloom. We are continually outraged by a social media and mainstream media machine that understands we engage better with outrage than we do with the things that make us happy. Dr. Seth Mandel, chairman of the psychiatry department at the Northwell Health Huntington Hospital in Huntington, New York, says, quote, "Social media continues to paradoxically cause people to be more isolated and out of touch with their feelings. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those feed our primal need to belong. We live for the little bit of euphoria from people liking our posts, retweeting our tweets, sharing our pictures. Facebook is free to use, and yet its owners and backers are billionaires. Remember, if the product is free, you are the product. And it's less like Big Brother than its step-cousin Mark, who spies on you, sells your whereabouts, your attention, your thoughts, and your outrage to the highest bidder. And for that, they will trade you a place to belong, where your every bizarre belief finds receptive ears and a sense of false community. They even brought the Flat Earth Society back from retirement after a 1,000-year hiatus. Yes, there is a Flat Earth Society. They have a presence on Facebook. But it's a free country. And social media can be a positive thing in your life that can be used to make meaningful connections. Facebook has no obligation to ensure your well-being. It's up to us to eat healthy foods. limit our junk internet time, and get exercise. And more, that means understanding exercising for our emotional and mental well-being, as well as our physical health. If you need help, please seek help. If you know someone who needs help, help them seek help. The more of us who understand and recognize mental health issues, the easier it will be for us to recognize when someone is on the verge of harming themselves or horrifically harming others. And we do need a place for those people to be treated. We need a place for people who are dangerously mentally ill to be before they can become a statistic as a mentally ill criminal, where they can be treated and hopefully recover before any crime needs to be committed. Yet while we are bombarded nonstop with news full of rage and ruin, yet while we can be legitimately incredulous that our president is currently being sued by a porn star, keep in mind, we have never lived in a safer time. The rates of homicide in the world are lower than has ever been recorded. And even in this age of Me Too, violence against women is less than a quarter of its peaks in the past. And while we mourn for some of our children, they as a whole are safer than they have ever been. Safer than when we left our doors unlocked and looked for them to come home after sundown. Steven Pinker, in a Wall Street Journal article, wrote, quote, "Violence has been in decline for thousands of years, and today we may be living in the most peaceable era in the existence of our species." He is correct, and the statistics bear it out. As well, the wealth we collectively and individually possess is unmatched by any nation in the history of the world. Most of even our poorest have devices in their pockets that can tell them where they are in the world and how to get where they're going. It'll answer their questions, solve their math problems, plan their day. And the wealthiest person just 20 years ago could not have bought that device for any price. No one goes hungry here who we cannot feed. And if you need help for mental illness or know someone who does, please seek the help. If you or anyone you know suffers from suicidal thoughts, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline can be reached at 1-800-273-8255 every hour of every day. If you've enjoyed this podcast or found it insightful, please subscribe, share our link, or give us a like on Facebook or Twitter. Every bit helps. If you have questions or comments or would like to connect with us, send us an email at podcast@civilmoment.com or go to our website at www.civilmoment.com and send us a message or subscribe to our newsletter. Until next time, thank you. This is Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. This podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.